What is the concept of God in the Chinese religions? And what can the Chinese religions teach the Abrahamic religions about how to get on together? Welcome to another episode of the Bordering on Belief podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Professor James Sellman. He is a professor and dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Guam. He has a PhD in Chinese philosophy, and his interests are Chinese philosophy, global philosophy, and Micronesian studies. James, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start off by asking, is religion even the right term when we come to deal with traditions in China?
That's a good question because, religion, the etymology of religion has a little bit of ambiguity in it. It can mean to tie down, and that works very well with the monotheistic traditions where, the God on high ties human beings down to the law, to the word of God. But the word religion can also mean to tie together. And in the East Asian traditions, that's the kind of religion that's most predominant, is community tying together. And also in China, there wasn't a faith versus reason dichotomy. Usually in the monotheistic traditions, right, there's something that you have to accept on faith and faith alone, like the salvation of your soul. And that can't be proven. You just have to accept it on faith. Or that discussion never occurred in China, that you had to believe in some things and some things were rational. As you ask me more questions, we'll tie this into Chinese transcendence. The gods are there, but they're always tied to nature, the human body, the environment, the government. The transcendent beings are always immanent in East Asia, especially in China.
Okay, well, that's a great kind of intro to the topic. So we're going to work through some of these traditions now. So let's start off with Confucianism. Could you tell us a little bit, just a brief introduction about what it is and where it stands vis-a-vis God?
Okay, that's, we could spend hours and hours on this topic. I'll tell you, one of my conversion experiences as an undergraduate, I read a passage in a book where a government official asked Confucius, how should he show respect to the gods and spirits, the ancestors? And Confucius says something like, first, you need to show respect to human beings. Worry about the gods and spirits later. And that was kind of a conversion experience for me. It was like, wow, here's a religion, here's a humanistic philosophy that I can work with. But it gets complex very, very quickly. According to the Analects, the Lunyue of Confucius, he did not talk about heaven. He did not talk about the gods and spirits, except for, two passages, that one passage I just mentioned. But the whole Confucian philosophy is based on the idea of Tian, heaven, and the Tianming, the mandate of heaven, and the Tianse, the emperor, the son of heaven, who will make sure the mandate of heaven is instituted in his government and on earth, or at least within the central kingdom of China. And so Tian as a god is there, but Confucius doesn't talk about it. He's trying to humanize the tradition because there was still human sacrifice going on in his lifetime. That was an ancient Shang dynasty practice where the nobility, especially the emperor, but royal families, would bury their servants and some of their animals, horses and chariots, with them so that they would, kind of like in Egypt, they would have servants in the afterlife and they would have food and a means to get along and so forth. And so Confucius was trying to humanize that whole approach. And yet, as Confucianism becomes kind of the state orthodoxy, from the Han Dynasty on, the emperors call themselves Tianse, the son of heaven, but they also call themselves Wangdi, the august emperor. And so they start to kind of mix the old Zhou Dynasty Confucian tradition with a new tradition that was started with Qin Shi Huangdi, the first generation emperor of the Qin dynasty. And Qin, China, that's where we get the name China, is from the Qin dynasty. So the mausoleum with all the famous terracotta soldiers are protecting the first emperor's tomb. And so this idea that the emperor on high is a god that is still looking after the community is still there to this very day. Now, we should say, in modern China, there's actually a law that prohibits children from being introduced to religion. Children
Wow.
and teenagers are not to be exposed to religion under, communist, atheistic China. But if you go to your neighborhood Chinese restaurant, I bet you there's an altar in that restaurant, right? The last time I was in Europe and had Chinese food, there was an altar there. Usually the altar is up high toward the ceiling. It's often for the god of wealth, the god of business. If they're Buddhists, it may be a Buddha. If the altar is on the floor, it may be an altar to Digong, to the local earth god, the local spirit of the soil. But so religion is alive and well in many different ways in Confucianism. After the Sung Dynasty, the Taiji, the yin-yang symbol, the great polarity, usually translated as the great ultimate, could be interpreted as a god. And one of my professors went to a Unitarian church conference and proposed that was the Neo-Confucian god, was the Taiji. So it gets complex very quickly because there are many different kinds of Confucianism. But in a nutshell, even Confucius became a god. So by 1911, he was declared by the end of the Qing dynasty to be Shangdi, to be the god on high. And
Really?
The Protestants use Shangdi for their translation of the Bible for God.
Just for us who don't know that much about Confucianism, what are its main precepts or teachings?
So Confucianism is primarily a moral philosophy, a moral way of life. The 5 main moral virtues, first and foremost, is Ren, human love or human kindness, usually translated as benevolence for some crazy reason. In the Analects, Confucius defines Ren as love, or it's in the later book, so it may be his disciple that defines it as love. The love is always expressed through ritual action, Li. That's the second major virtue, is everything. For Confucianism, even small ceremonies, even simple mannerisms like shaking hands or holding the door open for someone is really considered a ritual action rather than a lower form of ceremony. Then would come Shin, honesty or trustworthiness. The character shows the human figure standing by words. So to stand by your words, to be honest and sincere. Rightness, usually translated as righteousness for some reason. Nobody really talks like benevolence and righteousness, but rightness, justice, doing things appropriately, particularly for government officials to do things appropriately. And the last of the 5 main virtues is Jur. The pictograph shows arrow hitting the mark, hitting the target. Wisdom in action, to be able to do the right thing at the right time. Of course, filial piety is another big Confucian virtue, to love your parents more than strangers. It's a hierarchical system of love, right? You love your parents more than strangers. You love your immediate family more than fellow villagers. You love fellow villagers more than strangers. It's a tight hierarchy.
So somebody today looking at those virtues could strive to follow those without any concept of a higher being or creator god or anything like that. But originally you mentioned this concept of, heaven above and so on. Was that just taken for granted back then? Or would there been people who even then didn't have a concept of a higher god?
Yes, it was taken for granted because it was written in the ancient books that Confucius allegedly edited and put the 5 classics together. And so the predominant way of thinking was that Tian ruled the universe. And you still find this today in the nomadic peoples. The Mongols had this kind of belief. You still find it in Mongolia and Manchuria, and the tribal peoples of Central Asia still look at heaven or nature as the ultimate concern and the ultimate reality.
And Tien, just give us a bit more of an understanding of what Tien was.
Literally, it shows the pictograph is a big person standing under the sky. So it is nature, it is the heavens, but it becomes interpreted as a personal God that is concerned about the way the government is running. So this idea of the Tianming, the mandate of heaven, and the disciple of Confucius, Mencius, puts that in the hands of the people and says when the people rebel, that's a form of the mandate of heaven changing. And that's a pretty radical idea. And when the Mencius goes to Japan, oops, that line gets deleted because the strong imperial focus of the emperor in Japan is much stronger than in China as a descendant of the sun god and so forth. So that's interesting that Confucianism does get changed as it moves from culture to culture. But Tian was the predominant model until the Lao Tzu, until your next question about Daoism comes along, and the founder of Daoism, Lao Tzu, changes the metaphysical model from Tian to the Tao.
Well, you've led us straight into Daoism there. So yes, please carry on about Daoism and enlighten us.
Okay, so the legend has it that Confucius went to see Lao Tzu. Now, Lao Tzu literally means old master, and maybe it should be plural, old masters, because the evidence looks like the book that's called the Lao Tzu was probably written by a number of people, and it changed over the centuries. Because we've excavated a copy from like 163 BC, and it's not exactly the same as the received copy. So the story is that Confucius went to see Lao Tzu, to study with Lao Tzu, because he was the keeper of archives before he dropped out and got on a water buffalo and rode out of China to allegedly become the Buddha. The Taoists have lots of interesting ways of absorbing everything into their system. But when Confucius got back in the chariot, his disciples asked him, how did it go? And he said something like, we have the stringed arrow to catch the bird, and we have the net to catch the fish, but there's no way to catch a dragon, and today I met a dragon. That he kind of didn't fully understand what Lao Tzu was saying to him. But it's interesting in the paintings of this encounter, Confucius is always depicted as a very large figure, and Lao Tzu is kind of a small dwarf-like figure that, he's less important. But actually, according to the legend, Confucius didn't understand what he was saying. And so Taoism is very, very complex. And I'll tell you right up front, this distinction between classical Taoism and religious Taoism, I don't accept it. Okay, one of my professors was a professor and a Catholic priest and an ordained Taoist priest. He was a Daosher, a Taoist priest. And if you hang out with any Taoists, living Taoists today, they don't make such a distinction. As I was saying, there was no philosophy versus religion distinction in traditional China. And they don't see a distinction. And the so-called founding of the Taoist Church in the later Han Dynasty, around 184 BC, Zhang Daoling received a revelation from Lao Jun or Lao Tzu, Lord Lao. And some scholars say that's when religious Taoism begins. But look at who's he talking to. He's talking to Lao Jun, Lord Lao, another name for Lao Tzu. And his grandson writes a commentary on the Tao Te Ching, the way and its virtue, the book of Lao Tzu. And so Lao Tzu's right there at the beginning. And the strongest connection between the classical Taoism and the later Taoist temple Taoism is meditation. There is evidence of meditation practices in the Lao Tzu, in the Zhuangzi, and in other Taoist texts from the Warring States preach-in period that talk about meditation, apophatic, emptiness meditation in particular. And that's still in practice today with the Taoist priests. And even in performing rituals, the Taoist priests enter states of meditation to contact the spirits. That's another interesting thing about Taoism compared to most world religions. because it originated out of shamanism, and the history of Taoism is constantly fighting against shamanism. But one of the things that shamans do is they control the gods. And in Taoism, the priest also controls the gods.
What is meant by gods? Are we talking about kind of, spirits in nature, or are we talking about something celestial?
Yes, all of the above. Spirits in nature, spirits in the body, spirits in the government, spirits in the household, and spirits in the heavens and the stars. So, one of the traditional practices at New Year's, the family would gather together at the kitchen table at the hearth, and the hearth god would go to the heavens, would go into the stars, and meet the Jade Emperor and report on the family's moral behavior, so that the Jade Emperor could then, shorten or extend their life based on their moral behavior.
Okay.
So there are all kinds of gods in Taoism and in Chinese folk religion. But they are in the universe. They're not in an otherworldly place. They're in the stars, particularly Sirius. The star Sirius and that constellation is often seen as a home place for Lao Tzu. Some of the Kung Fu teachers today will tell you they got their information from the spirits in Sirius.
And so what would you say are the core teachings of Taoism?
The core teachings of Taoism: be natural, stay with the Tao, go with the flow. One of the first surfer stories is in the Zhuangzi, the second major classic of ancient Taoism, where Confucius is walking along the gorge, the Yangtze River Gorge, and he sees a guy down by the water, and he sends his disciple down to tell the guy, look at, go in a boat, don't go swimming. What are you doing down here? You're too close to the rapids. And while they're going down to warn him, the guy jumps into the river and he body surfs the rapids. And then he pops out of the river just as easily as he went in. And Confucius asks him, how did you do that? And the sober answer is, I go with the flow. The water pushes me down and I go down. It throws me up and I go up. I don't fight the current, which is good advice if you're ever, stuck in a tidal flow. Go with it.
Riptide or something.
Fight it. You'll wear yourself out. Go with nature is the main teaching. But then as Taoism develops, it absorbs all of the Confucian moral virtues. And so there are all kinds of interesting Taoist stories of filial piety. So they absorb the Confucian teachings.
And going with nature, is this kind of subduing your ego so that you act on instinct rather than on thought? Is that what this is about?
Possibly. I have an article discussing the story of the butcher Ding, who chops up an ox very easily and very quickly. And so he's not really acting on instinct, but his knife doesn't need to be sharpened, he says, because he cuts between the joints where there is a space. He cuts into the void rather than trying to chop the bones and the meat. And so it is more like Csikszentmihalyi's idea of going with the flow than following instincts. You do have to work at it. You have to remember to forget the traditional teachings. You have to remember to forget the way you were raised in society. A lot of Taoism is kind of antinomian. So they would leave their families and move into the mountains, live as hermits. When Buddhism came in, then Taoism started a monastic tradition of monks living in a monastery. So there's all different kinds of Taoism also. And one of the main ideas of Taoism is to become an immortal. And there's a practice of external alchemy where you take chemicals, which often led to people's death because one of the main chemicals was mercury, because there was something interesting about mercury. They recognized in ancient times it had metallic qualities and it was fluid. And so it was kind of a substance that was transformational. So the ancient alchemists thought, maybe it would help transform you into an immortal, but then people died of mercury poisoning. And then internal alchemy came in, where that apophatic meditation and doing different kinds of meditation practices to balance the chi energies in the body to make one immortal. But I analyze this as a metaphor for union with the Tao. If you become one with Tao, if you become one with the primordial forces of nature, then you live forever, not personally, not your ego, but as union with the Tao. Kind of spiritual immortality or metaphysical immortality rather than personal immortality. So you could say that the idea of you'll become a physical immortal, which all the stories describe it that way, is a kind of skillful teaching, like borrowed from Buddhism. You tell people exciting stories that they could live, because you get similar stories in Chinese Buddhism, that, Bodhidharma, the guy who brought Buddhism into China, when they went back to his grave, the only thing that was there was a slipper. And he was missing. His corpse was gone. So it's like, well, those Buddhist saints, those bodhisattva, may also be immortal. But immortal in what sense, right? Because the whole idea of Buddhism and Daoism is to cut down the ego, to get away from ego attachment. So when you gain your nirvana or gain your oneness with the Tao, it becomes a metaphysical immortality rather than a spiritual immortality, a physical immortality of your personal self.
And does Taoism have a kind of origin story for how we got here, or the relationship of the Tao to the universe that we see?
Well, chapter 42 of the Lao Tzu Tao Te Ching says that the Tao generated the one generated the two generated the three, and the three gave birth to the myriad things. So you could say, well, here's a zero. Here's another interpretation of the zero. Maybe it didn't only come from ancient India, that the Tao is the zero, the void, because there are other passages say that something comes from nothing. So is the Tao the zero, and then as a zero, it's a one. And then with the zero and the one, you've got two, and the zero, the one, and the two are three. And then all
Infinite
things unfold
sets,
from
yeah.
there. So there is a kind of cosmogony there, but I would say it's an ongoing, continuous cosmogony. It's not like there was a creation day. The creation is continuously unfolding.
And there's never a sense that the Tao is personal in any way.
That's
It's
right.
always
That's right.
impersonal. Yeah.
It's very, very impersonal. And there is a passage in the Lao Tzu that says that the Tao existed before Shangdi. So the Tao existed before God. It existed before heaven and earth. And it's from the Tao that everything is unfolding continuously. But it's not a personal. So this is where, even when the gods are personal, they're very much immanent. They're tied to nature. They're not in an otherworldly existence. So for example, when people go to the temple and make offerings and pray for something, if they don't get it, they'll go to another temple. There's no suffering of Job kind of thing, where you're going to suffer anyways. And there are cases where people made serious offerings and didn't get it and went back and damaged the temple, burned it down, destroyed the temple. They were so upset that they didn't get what they want. And then they change and go to another temple also. So it's a lot like a business deal when it comes to Chinese religion.
And just to help me understand the Tao a little more, I've learned to become a bit more hesitant about drawing parallels with other traditions. But is this similar to a kind of panentheism where there's, everything is somehow the Tao in expression, but the Tao is also something beyond?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it is kind of like a pantheism and a cosmotheism, something like that. Because the Tao is in everything. Everything depends on the Tao. And yet, it has different layers. So the primordial Tao is a void, is a nothing. And then there is a Tao of being and substance where everything is in the universe. But it is impersonal. Yeah.
And the Confucian virtues, you said they were absorbed into Taoism. So Daoism itself didn't give birth to a code of conduct or a kind of moral thing. It imported it, would you say?
Well, okay, so there are some of in the Han Dynasty Taoist texts, there's a lot of concern about nature, and that you don't find much of that in Confucianism. The famous saying, the stables caught on fire, and Confucius asked, was anyone hurt? He didn't ask how the horses were. Whereas some of the Taoist literature, they're concerned about not draining the pond, not damming up rivers, not cutting down too many trees, not destroying bird nests when there are eggs in the bird nest. And so there is a lot of Taoist concern for environmental ethics in the early texts. But then part of the way to sainthood or immortality in Taoism is to be a filial child to your parents, to give charity to the poor. Many times the Taoist sages or saints would show up as a beggar and kind of test nobility to see how generous they were to somebody who was stinky and poor, and then come back as a shining, glowing immortal and tell them why they're not going to make it. So, those Confucian virtues were so dominant in society that it was, and they also line up with the Buddhist teachings, also with the Buddhist virtues. And, and that's kind of what helps generate the three religions, the Sanjiao, as a religion itself.
So let's go into Buddhism then. So we've got the background of Confucianism and Taoism. Where does Buddhism fit into this picture? Obviously, it came from outside of China. How did it arrive, and how did it integrate?
Well, the legend has it that Bodhidharma surfed into China on a banana leaf. That's a cute story. There was a lot of trading going on. Once a art professor pointed out at a lecture that in the Warring States period, 300 BC, there are incense burners. And it doesn't quite fit unless there was contact with India and burning sandalwood incense. And that makes a lot of sense. And so there was undoubtedly contact before the 2nd century BC, when most scholars say that Buddhism started to come into China. And most likely it was through business people trading, although that story of Bodhidharma surfing in on a banana leaf is very, very attractive.
Well, we're not going to forget that one. Yeah.
Yeah. And then there's the story of the Buddhist monk, a Chinese Buddhist monk who traveled to India, collected as many sutras as he could, started to translate them in India, brought them back to China. He walked there through the Silk Road through Asia, came down through Afghanistan, and then came back by the ocean because they were, trading along sea routes then also. And so he brought back a lot of sutras and started the translation of the sutras. And so the one story is that Lao Tzu is the Buddha, that when Lao Tzu left China, he underwent different physical transformations, and one of them was that he became Siddhartha Gautama.
Yeah.
And that's partly why the teachings are so similar, supposedly. But then you can't have Zen Buddhism or Chinese Chan Buddhism without the mixing of Buddhism and Taoism, especially the Zhuangzi. Really brings about the Zen or Chan phenomenon, which has kind of an antinomian twist to it, to do things a little bit differently.
Yeah, so let's just expand into that a little bit. What were the new teachings, philosophies, concepts that Buddhism brought into China?
So one thing is it's probably the case that a lot of the Buddhism coming into China wasn't Orthodox Buddhism, but was kind of a heterodox form of Buddhism that was mixed with Samkhya dualism. Because as Buddhism goes into Nepal, Shiva is taken, the Buddha is taken to be an incarnation of Shiva, and there's a mixing of Shivism and Buddhism and Samkhya get all kind of mixed in, and some of that was brought into China. because there seems to be a hidden idea that there is a soul in Chinese Buddhism, which totally goes against the Anatman teaching of original Buddhism. It's interesting that both Buddhism and Daoism are based on a medical model. The ancient monasteries in India had hospitals connected to them. The Buddhist monasteries had hospitals connected to them. They found the hemostats and the different kinds of scalpels and whatnot. And Daoism also has kind of a medical model. How can you live comfortably? How could you extend your life and not die from being stressed out from the trappings of society, trying to get ahead in society will stress you out. And Daoism has a similar idea that you need to release your stress and get away from that lifestyle in order to live longer and live better. So there is kind of a medical model at the core of both Buddhism and Daoism. But what Buddhism brings to China is something radical, and especially the Confucians, but even some Taoists have trouble with it because it brought in the idea of the monastery and that the most important thing you could do with your life was not pay attention to your family, that really you should leave your family and kind of join the monastery, or like the Taoists, get into the mountains and start meditating and have less family connections. And that caused a lot of controversy. And then Buddhism had to try to adjust to that in China by bringing more family values into Chinese Buddhism.
Would you say that these three traditions kind of just mixed together to make, they all took from each other to make unique, there was a kind of give and take of all of them to each other, or was the direction more from one to others?
Well, so by the Sung Dynasty, Sung Dynasty starts 960 Common Era. A new religion started called the Three Teachings. And so it was actually self-proclaimed, we're using Confucianism, Daoism, and Buddhism as the foundation of our religion. So the Three Teachings began, and it was a religion in itself and is still in existence today. At the same time, what became the orthodox form of Neo-Confucianism, Jushi's teachings, at first when Jushi presented the Taiji, that yin-yang symbol, he was criticized by other Confucians and accused of treason and heterodoxy because the chart that he had, that his teacher had, came from Daoism. And it was clearly a Taoist alchemical chart. And everybody knew this, and yet he was bringing it into his Confucian teaching for his cosmology. And so Confucianism was already borrowing from Taoism. Taoism was already borrowing from Confucianism. Zen, Chan had already borrowed from Taoism. And since the moral teachings were so similar, that you should give charity, be kind to people, do the right thing, tell the truth, and that all of these had kind of a contextual formula to them, which a lot of people, will say, no, don't try to contextualize this. It's all absolute. Well, it's actually not absolute laws. It's a kind of contextualism or situational ethics. And all of these, in all those three traditions, I can give you a couple stories if you want, but then the three teachings developed. And last year I was in Hong Kong, and the host took us to a Taoist temple. And one of the first things they said was, we practice the three teachings here. Even though it was a traditional Taoist temple, it had now absorbed Confucianism and Buddhism in their teachings.
And you said this happened during the dynasty, but was it state mandated, state enforced? Did they all get the state kind of seal of approval to come together as this thing? Was it a conscious top-down way of living that the rulers were trying to promote?
No, I think it was a bottom-up. It was a bottom-up. What the rulers were still promoting was Confucianism. And so there was the big debate in the Sung Dynasty, should you go with Lu Shangshang's approach or Jushi's approach? by the end of the Sung Dynasty, everybody was agreeing Jushi was the master. In the Ming Dynasty and Qing Dynasty, it was still Confucianism, was still the main state orthodoxy.
And how widespread was the three teachings concept? Was it kind of universal?
Yes, yeah. Especially by the 20th century, everybody had absorbed it. So there was the sect or religion called the three teachings, and then everybody else had absorbed the other traditions. So they might say, oh, I'm a Confucian, but I understand Buddhist and Taoist ethics. And I might be a Taoist, but I understand Confucian and Buddhist ethics. And I'm a Buddhist, but I understand Taoist and Confucian ethics.
And how much of these three traditions and the three teachings influences the way China looks at the world today?
Oh, well, the way China looks at the world today is atheistic communism.
But what I'm saying is, behind that, is there something in the psychology, the inherited psyche of China, or was atheist communism quite effective at eradicating that from the people who espouse communism?
Well, so that now is hard to tell. So, according to the statistics, in preparing for this, I started, doing some Google research about modern China, since I primarily focus on the ancient stuff to try to escape from the horrors of the 21st century. But so, they're saying that folk religion is the most popular. 20 to 30% of Chinese people still practice some kind of folk religion. Yes, of course, because babies are born and you need some blessing at a birth, and people get married, and you need some blessing when you get married, and people die, and you need some blessing at the funeral. And so, kind of rites of passage and whatnot. They're at the folk level, there's religious practice. You don't really want to say very much about it, though, because the government might give you a hard time, especially during the Cultural Revolution. Monks were killed, and they were sent to education camps and whatnot, and professors were sent to education camps, and so you don't really want to talk about it. And as I mentioned, the PRC has this rule that you cannot indoctrinate children and teenagers in religion. It interferes with the national education system. So you could say that nationalism is kind of the modern religion. But of course, people are going to turn to, some gods and spirits when things get tough. And so maybe the Chinese spirit of embracing all of the teachings is what happened after Mao Zedong, when China opened up and opened up the temples and started to restore temples, and saw that it was a tourism industry and they could bring in money by letting foreigners go to the temples. And if a few Chinese people went back to the temple, it's okay as long as we watch them carefully. So you have to keep in mind that for 2,000 years, the political rebellions were led by people who identified as Taoists or Buddhists. And so that's why, like, Falun Gong is not accepted. Supposedly it's a Buddhist sect. They say they're Buddhists and they should have freedom of religion. But the PRC is very concerned that they could quickly turn into a rebel group. And so you got 2,000 years of rebellions against political order from those, Taoists and Buddhists seeking social justice.
But what I'm trying to get at is, I feel that in the West, we have a lot of what they call Judeo-Christian, or I would call them biblical values, that are just have become part of society. People don't even realize that they often have a biblical origin. In the same way, in modern China, are there Confucian, Taoist, even Buddhist values which have just permeated the psyche but are not labeled as part of the religion?
Oh, for sure.
Tell us
The
about
family. The family values and the desire to return to your home village to be buried is still so that all of the ancestors are in the same cemetery, and the descendants know where the ancestors are and know where they can go to make offerings to the ancestors is still a driving force in many people's minds. They after they retire, they return to their hometown. Or even if they can work it out, to return before they retire to get back to their hometown. One of my friends just finally got back to Shanghai as a professor, where his hometown is in Shanghai. And so he's very excited to be back home. So those kind of values are so deeply ingrained that they're there without questioning and without thinking about them, for sure.
And if I could ask you just a personal question, from your study of the ancient Chinese traditions, what teachings have you most benefited from in your own life? Are there any which you feel like you've consciously adopted or tried to align with?
Oh yeah, yeah. That whole thing about meditation and stress relief. The yoga, Chinese yoga is qigong. And the qigong literally means energy work. You hear this in popular discussions today at yoga places. You're going to do energy work. Well, that's originally qigong. So those kind of practices definitely have kept me alive, maybe to make it to this stage, especially, trying to herd cats, as we say, in academic administration.
And what do you think the Abrahamic religions could learn from the Chinese religions?
Well, what some of them have been doing is going to meditation centers, particularly the Trappist monks in particular, and to turn prayer into rapid prayer, into chanting, and turn that into a form of meditation with form, and then to go to formless apophatic meditation.
I just find it quite interesting about how these three traditions were able to coexist and even come up with some sort of syncretic or harmonized way. And obviously, we don't see that with the three Abrahamic religions so easily. Why do you think the Chinese religions were able to do that and the three Abrahamic religions were not? Is it this focus on propositional beliefs that is the barrier with the Abrahamic religions, do you think?
That would be a good place to start. Yeah, yeah. So that kind of top-down approach of religion, and that these are the laws and these are the laws that you must follow, versus what brings us together in community, what keeps the community together, would be a good place to start. And that kind of business model, what's going to work.
Pragmatism, basically.
There was a form of Marco Polo, one of the Marco Polo movies, where Genghis Khan says, there are five major religions in the empire today. Who can really say which one is the correct one? Why don't we embrace them all? Kind of approach. So it's more pragmatic, more down to earth. What's going to work? Let's focus on what's going to work. There's something here in all of these. If one of them doesn't work, we can easily switch to the other one without causing too much trouble, unless you really get frustrated and go back and burn the temple down.
James Sellman, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. This was a great pleasure.